There are shows that become legends, but Hill Street Blues sounds like it had to survive a curse. If you ever watch this series, you already remember the smell of it. That police station so cramped, it felt hard to breathe, those tired faces, and a city every bit as chaotic as the one we are living in right now. This is the series that had more than a few viewers practically wishing it would die young, and then it closed out with the most prestigious win there is. You think you understood it, but the truth is, you did not. Today, I want to take you back to Hill Street and walk through the 20 strangest facts behind this landmark, from its battles with censorship to those bizarre turns of fate, all the way to behind-the-scenes stories that sound made up but are actually true. Let us bring a masterpiece back to life. Are you ready? Number 20. This show started with a deal that was almost insane. There is one thing I've always loved about Hill Street Blues, and it is that this show did not come into the world as some nice, obedient little TV drama. NBC wanted a new cop show. Stephen Bochco and Michael Kozoll looked at that formula and were sick of it. The two of them pretty much said it outright: if all you want is another clean, easy to swallow by the book police series, go find somebody else. But if you want something more alive, messier, and more honest about the worn-out smell of American city streets, then we can sit down and talk. The strange part is that still was not even the boldest move. Before they really got going, they actually asked to meet with NBC's standards department just to see where the guardrails were. Usually people make the show first, and then censors come down on them afterward. Bochco and Kozoll did the opposite. They walked right up to the front door like they already knew they were about to make trouble and wanted to stare the control machine in the face from the very beginning. And NBC's reaction really was one big collective frown. Too violent, too sexual, too bleak. In other words, too different from the kind of network television America was used to being sold in 1981. And still, out of that nearly insane deal, a landmark was born. Bochco later said they had no idea what the hell they were doing. They were just feeling their way through it, taking a wild chance, and somehow it worked. And trust me, that madness was only the opening act. Because once this series actually hit the air, America reacted in a way that was even harder to believe. And that brings us straight to fact number 19. Number 19. Hill Street Blues was the kind of show critics loved before audiences came around. That really is unusual. Most of the time, a show has to win over the crowd first. The audience likes it, the network is happy, and then the press and the awards come drifting in afterward. Hill Street Blues did almost the exact opposite. Critics saw its value first, while mainstream viewers were still pushing back on it in the beginning. It is true. The pilot got knocked for being confusing, too heavy, full of characters people did not like, and packed with too many loose ends that stayed loose. Then, Season 1 fell almost all the way to the bottom of the ratings. You have to understand, on network TV in the early 80s, a number like that was not just bad news. That was almost the smell of death. Plenty of other shows would have looked at that and been finished. And to me, that is the strangest part of all. Some shows get discovered by the public first. Hill Street Blues got saved first by people who understood the craft. And the irony is, while the whole series was still fighting to survive in real life, right there in its very first episode, there was also a character who almost did not survive long enough to keep going. Number 18. Renko almost disappeared in the very first minute. If you remember the shooting in the first episode of Hill Street Blues, there is a good chance you remember it the way I used to. A rough, ice-cold opening, enough to tell the audience, this series was not about to hand them some safe little world. But the strange detail behind that scene is the part that really matters. The person who was actually supposed to be gone after that shooting was not Hill. It was Renko. In other words, Charles Hyde walked into that show with almost no guarantee of a future there. At first, he was only meant to be a short-term part, almost more like a quick favor for Bochco than a face that was going to put down roots at the Hill Street station. After the first episode was finished, Hyde even went off to do other work like Renko's story was already over. And I think that says a whole lot about Hill Street Blues. Right from episode 1, this show already felt like it was rewriting its own fate while the cameras were still rolling. And once even a character's future was that shaky, it turns out the title of this series was not nearly as simple as a lot of people thought, either. Number 17. The name Hill Street Blues is sadder than you think. There are titles you hear so many times they just settle into your ear to the point where you stop asking what they really mean. Hill Street Blues is one of those titles. But I am telling you, the older I get, the more I go back to old television, the more I think this title was chosen with real skill. The words Hill Street sound simple enough, just the name of the precinct. But blues is where the real weight is. Sure, it brings to mind the blue of an American police uniform. That is true. But it also brings in the sadness of blues music, that tired, dragging feeling, that little burn in the throat this show carries from start to finish. What I love most is that the title does not just sound good, it sounds right. Right for a city that has seen better days. Right for a police station that is never really calm. Right for people dressed in blue when every one of them is carrying some private sadness inside. People even like to point out that the phrase Hill Street Blues only really gets spoken one time in the whole series, and even then it comes with a slightly mocking tone. Like the show itself understood exactly how beautiful and bitter its own name was. And then you start to see that this sadness is not just sitting there in the title. Sometimes it walks right onto the screen, cold as ice and very real, and leaves the whole show hurting. Number 16. The strangest death landed on the one person nobody expected. If you asked me who kept Hill Street Blues from flying apart every time things started slipping off the rails, I would say Phil Esterhaus right away. He had that kind of presence where he did not need to do much at all for the whole room to quiet down on its own. All he had to do was walk into roll call and start talking, and suddenly that police station that had been wobbling all over the place had a heartbeat again. Some characters do not need to dominate the screen with drama. They are the ones who keep the whole world of the show standing. Esterhaus was one of those people. That is why the way the show sent him off feels both shocking and bitter to me. After Michael Conrad died in real life, Hill Street Blues had to write Phil Esterhaus out of the story, and they did not pick some heroic death, not a shootout, not some sacrifice out on the street. No, the show tells us he died of a heart attack while he was in bed with Grace Gardner. You see it right, that is exactly the kind of detail only Hill Street Blues would dare to do. Strange, and with that dry little edge of black comedy. Because the most decent man, the calmest man, almost the most honorable man in that whole world, ends up going out in a way that is awkward and painfully human. Number 15. Stephen Bochco made another show to replace Hill Street Blues. There is something about Stephen Bochco that I have always found really interesting. He was not the kind of guy who makes one difficult piece of work gets ignored by the mass audience and then sits there complaining that the world just is not sophisticated enough to understand him. No, Bochco was sharper than that. He looked at Hill Street Blues, looked at everything that show got right, and almost pulled a very expensive lesson out of it. What if I keep the maturity, the sharpness, the eye for working professionals, and the cracks in adult life, but make it easier for America's living rooms to let it in? And then L.A. Law showed up. Bochco did not turn his back on the spirit of Hill Street Blues. He just took it. Somewhere else brushed off some of the street grime, swapped the police station for a law office, swapped that gray, exhausted look for shinier lighting, prettier faces, and a rhythm that could pull viewers in a little more easily. But underneath it all, it was still the same creative brain, still the same pleasure of watching adults work, fall in love, crash into each other, and make a tangled mess of their own lives. Number 14. Andy Renko was only supposed to appear in one episode. Those of you who love Andy Renko might be surprised to hear that at first, he was not meant to be one of the long-haul faces. Quite the opposite. He was exactly the kind of character built to come in strong, make a fast impression, and then disappear before the audience even had time to get used to him. Charles Hyde took the role with almost that same mindset. Do the job, then move on. And if that had happened honestly, it would not have been strange at all. Television back then did that kind of thing all the time. A character shows up at the start, takes the shock the story needs, then steps aside so the machine can keep moving. But right from the beginning, Hill Street Blues was not the kind of show that liked moving in a straight line. Number 13. A radio line became the fingerprint of the whole series. Some shows leave you with a face in your head. Some leave you with a line of dialogue. But Hill Street Blues did something pretty rare. It left you with a sound. The second that opening radio call comes on, the whole world of the show comes rushing back. A voice over the radio. A robbery in progress. Some street corner somewhere. And just like that, you get pulled straight into the shift, into the pressure, into the fast-breathing rhythm of a city that never agrees to calm down. That is why I think this radio line is better than just some ordinary opening detail. It feels like the fingerprint of the whole series. You might forget a certain case. You might forget some supporting character who drifted by in some season. But the shows that really stay with you usually leave you with something much simpler. A rhythm, a sound, a door. And with Hill Street Blues, that door opens through radio waves. Number 12. This show did not just have one police station. It had a whole invisible city. Maybe not everybody notices this right away. This show did not just build one police station and lock everything inside it. It gave you the feeling that beyond the walls we could see, beyond the faces we knew by name, there was a whole city out there, living, cracking apart, and boiling over everywhere, just outside the frame. Throughout the series, a whole lot of different police districts get mentioned. Hill Street is only one of them. The rest feel like part of a whole network of names that pop up over the radio in reports and dialogue. Like this city has a real map, real borders, real areas where trouble boils up in very different ways. I have always loved filmmaking like that. It does not dump the whole world in your lap in some flashy way. It just scatters a few small pieces around, then lets your imagination connect the rest. Number 11. 3 familiar faces from the show were gone far too soon. There are faces in Hill Street Blues that feel so familiar, you almost take for granted they will always be there. And maybe that is why this is the fact that hits me hardest on the whole list. Because behind a show that had so much to say about exhaustion loss and how fragile life is, real life also brought losses that came much too early. Michael Conrad passed away in 1983 while Hill Street Blues was still on the air. That alone is enough to leave a lump in your throat. Because Esterhaus was not just a character, he was part of the heartbeat of that whole police station. Then, a few years later, Rene Enriquez and Keel Martin also passed away in 1990. When you look back now, you realize those faces that once felt so familiar have actually been gone for a very long time. If you still remember Esterhaus, still remember Calatano, still remember LaRue, leave their names down in the comments. Sometimes the nicest way to honor old familiar faces is just to let them know people still remember them. Number 10. The show looked like Chicago, but most of it was actually made in Los Angeles. Old American television could pull off better magic than people gave it credit for. If you remember Hill Street Blues as this gray, worn-down place that smelled like cold concrete and felt as tired as an industrial city in the Midwest or the Northeast, you are not remembering it wrong. The strange part is that most of that feeling was actually created in Los Angeles. That is right. The opening used footage of Chicago, and those shots really did lock the show's very specific smell into people's heads. But most of the episodes were shot in Los Angeles, a place people usually associate with sunshine, palm trees, and a much cleaner kind of light. What I love most is that the location team had to do something that was both funny and deeply professional: keep palm trees out of the frame. Let even one row of palms slip in there, and the illusion broke right away. The whole atmosphere of a city worn down by pressure dust and those endless shifts was gone in a second. Number 9. The creator of this series did not even get to stay with it to the end. There are some Hollywood stories that get more bitter the more you sit with them. Hill Street Blues has Steven Bochco's fingerprints all over it, so clearly you can almost not mistake it for anything else. That is why the strangest thing here is not just how this series changed American television. The strangest thing is that the man who helped create its soul did not get to stay with it until the very end. That was not some graceful farewell, and it definitely was not the kind of departure people like to dress up with polite thank yous. The more I look back on it, the more it feels like a breakup full of bitterness. Behind the Emmys, the praise, and the growing reputation, there were still all the old familiar Hollywood problems: money, power, production costs, oversized egos, and the coldest question in every meeting room: whether a show, no matter how great it was still worth the system carrying it any further. Number 8. Ed Marinaro went in to audition for another show, then just happened to walk out with the role of Joe Coffey. People like to think memorable roles come from grand auditions, careful planning, and those big dramatic talent searches. But that is not always how it goes. Sometimes a role shows up because you happen to be in the right hallway, on the right day, opened the right door, and accidentally stepped into a career turn even you did not see coming. Ed Marinaro was not at MTM that day for Hill Street Blues. He was there to audition for another project, a movie about male strippers, which already sounds like it belongs in a completely different universe from that grim little police station. Then, right at that same time, MTM was also casting for Hill Street Blues. So Marinaro went ahead and read for that too. It almost sounds like a joke, but that quick stop is what gave us Joe Coffey. Number 7. Bochco got under the censors' skin with nothing more than an episode title. If you want to know what kind of person Steven Bochco was, sometimes you do not even need to watch a whole season. Just look at how he titled an episode. Some television people see the standards department raise an eyebrow and immediately take a step back. Bochco did not. The second he heard objections, it was almost like he wanted to push a little harder, just to see where the real line was. And on Hill Street Blues, one of his funniest little acts of mischief started with nothing more than a title, Moon over Uranus. And the best part is, he did not stop at one. After annoying people plenty with that first title, he kept going with Moon over Uranus the sequel, and then Moon over Uranus the final legacy. At that point, it was not just a title anymore. It was a long, dry wink, and a very Steven Bochco one. And maybe that stubborn streak is exactly why Hill Street Blues became a place where so many young faces passed through before all of Hollywood realized just how big they were going to be. Number 6. This show was like a waiting room for future stars. There is a very specific kind of fun in going back to Hill Street Blues, and it is not just about the stories or the atmosphere. It is that moment when you are watching along. Normally, then suddenly you squint and wonder if you saw that right, and then it hits you. Hang on, did that person not go on to become a huge star later? That feeling happens over and over to the point where sometimes I think Hill Street Blues was not just a cop series. It was more like a crowded waiting room where the future of Hollywood sat shoulder to shoulder before the rest of the world knew who they were. Then you start seeing those names pop up. Tim Robbins, Forrest Whitaker, Lawrence Fishburne, Andy Garcia, Don Cheadle, Linda Hamilton, Joaquin Phoenix. One face after another goes drifting through like a whole generation of major actors stopped by this police station before moving on to the movies that made their names. If one of those names just made you do a double take, leave it down in the comments and tell me which face surprised you the most. But for now, get ready. We are into the last 5 facts. Number 5. Even Sammy Davis Jr. loved this show enough to want in on it. You probably would not expect these two worlds to touch. On one side, you had Sammy Davis Jr., the world of tuxedos, stage lights, and that kind of glamour, where all he had to do was walk in and the whole room turned to look. On the other side, you had Hill Street Blues, that gray police station full of cold coffee, harsh fluorescent light, and people who looked like life had already beaten them a few rounds earlier. And yet, somehow, Sammy Davis Jr. got pulled right into that exhausted world. What makes it even better is that it did not start with some grand formal invitation. It started by accident, almost in a very everyday kind of way. Bochco wrote a line in the show that mentioned Sammy. Then the two of them met. And from the way the story gets told, Sammy was openly thrilled, almost lit up with excitement. Not polite excitement either. The real thing. He genuinely loved it. Loved it enough to want to be in Hill Street Blues. Number 4. Mike Post wrote this opening theme in the blink of an eye. There are some themes where the second you hear them, a whole world appears right in front of you. For me, the Hill Street Blues opening has always been one of those. Just a few notes, and that police station, those faces, that whole rhythm of life comes rushing right back. And that is exactly why this part impresses me so much. Mike Post only took about 2 hours to write that melody. 2 hours. Something that sounds like it had been living with the show forever, like it had soaked into the air before the cameras even started rolling, was actually born so fast it almost sounds ridiculous. And the smarter choice was that Stephen Bochco did not want the music to pile more chaos onto what was already happening on screen. He wanted it to do the opposite. The images were tense, dirty, and frantic. The music softened everything like one beautiful sigh. That contrast is what made people remember it. Number 3. The first episode of this series got slammed almost without mercy. Can you believe that Hill Street Blues, the show that would later be seen as one of the most important series in American television history, was once received like it was a mistake? Test audiences were not gentle with it at all. They said it was too confusing. They found the characters hard to connect with, hard to like. They did not like the ending of the first episode. They were annoyed by how many story threads were left hanging. And the thing that bothered them most was that the police station looked so chaotic, it felt like even the people enforcing the law could not control the place they were standing in. Then the ratings were even more brutal. Season 1 of Hill Street Blues fell almost to the very bottom landing at 87 out of 96. You have to understand, on network television in the early 80s, that was not some small stumble. That was the kind of number that got a lot of other series cleared right off the schedule without even a backward glance. Number 2. This series that almost died young turned into a $1 million gamble. A show that viewers rejected right out of the gate. And then just a few years later, it had grown into something so expensive, the whole industry had to turn around and stare. People often talk about Hill Street Blues as the first weekly series to hit the $1 million mark per episode. That contradiction alone is enough to make this story memorable. That number does not sound crazy at all once you really understand how this show was made. A huge cast, multiple storylines stacked on top of each other. The shooting style, the editing, the sound work, all of it was more ambitious, denser, and tougher than what network television was usually doing at the time. A show like that was never going to be cheap, and the costs just kept climbing. It started out expensive, then got even more expensive. By the middle of the 80s, what NBC had to pay had already gone past $1 million an episode, and by the end of the run, the average cost was around $1.5 million for every hour on the air. At that point, this was not some show filling a hole in the schedule anymore. It was a real gamble. But we are not done yet. Come with me to the last fact, because this one might make you see the whole show differently. Number 1. From getting torn apart. Hill Street Blues walked into the Emmys and cleaned out the room. When I look back at the whole run of Hill Street Blues, the thing I admire most is not just how different it was. What I admire is that it survived doubt. This was a series people called confusing heavy and hard to warm up to, a show that left plenty of viewers at first not even knowing what to do with it. And then it walked into its first Emmy night like it did not need anybody's permission anymore. And it went ahead and took 8 trophies for that first season. 8. Just hearing that number tells you how beautifully the whole story turned around. What I love most is that the win was not just a win. It felt like the verdict got flipped. The very things that once got on people's nerves about Hill Street Blues were the same things the television industry later held up and celebrated. Everything that once seemed too strange, too messy, too hard to take in, ended up becoming proof that the future of American television was standing right there in front of them. To me, the shows that really last are not the ones born to applause. They usually come in a rougher way with more edges on them. People doubt them at first. They get called too messy, too heavy, too different. Then, little by little, they force both the audience and the whole industry to change the way they look at them. Hill Street Blues was that kind of show. It did not walk into history through the front door. It fought its way into its place with stubbornness, personality, and a kind of realism that still carries weight even now. If you still remember old American television too, if you still remember that feeling where the opening theme starts and a whole world appears, leave a line down in the comments. Tell me your memory of Hill Street Blues, mention the character you still have a soft spot for, or let me know which classic show you want us to dig back up next.